It was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. And maybe it was. The sun was kind that afternoon, soft, golden, almost too perfect. It poured through the stained glass windows of St. Mary's Chapel, touching every white petal and crystal glass. Laughter spilled into the courtyard, music hummed under the chatter of guests, and somewhere inside that glowing room a young woman, Emily, was saying, "I do." Outside, a man stood by the door. His suit was clean but old, the kind of dark gray that had seen too many winters. His shoes were polished, though cracked at the seams. He clutched a small gift wrapped in silver paper, its corners a little wrinkled from the tremor in his hands. His name was Robert Hale, and he was Emily's father. He stood there for a long time, not moving, just listening. Every now and then the wind carried pieces of the ceremony out to him, a cheer, a toast, the sound of champagne corks. He smiled each time, a faint, fragile smile that tried to say, "I'm happy for her." But his eyes, they betrayed him. They were wet, red at the edges, tired from months of pain that had no name to anyone but him. A young man in a black vest, a waiter, maybe 20, maybe less, noticed him standing there. "Sir," he said politely, "are you looking for someone? The ceremony's inside." Robert hesitated. His lips parted, then closed again. He looked down at the small gift in his hand, a silver frame with two pictures, one of a little girl in a pink dress and another of a woman in a white gown. He took a deep breath. "No," he said softly, "I'm just not invited." The waiter blinked, unsure what to say. "I'm sorry, sir." Robert smiled again, that same gentle smile, and shook his head. "Don't be," he whispered. "It's still a beautiful day." He took a few steps back from the door, far enough that no one inside could see him. He leaned against the wall and let the sounds of joy wash over him. Someone started playing "Here Comes the Sun." He laughed quietly. Of course, he thought. Emily loved that song since she was 10. He remembered her spinning around the kitchen, flour on her nose, singing along with the radio. "Daddy, it's the happy song," she used to say, and he'd nod, tapping the counter with his spoon. "Then let's make it our song." Now the same tune floated through the air, but she wasn't singing it with him. She was dancing with someone else, her husband. From where he stood, Robert could see through the glass just enough to catch glimpses of her, the edge of her dress, the movement of her hair when she laughed. Every time she turned, his heart skipped. Every time she smiled, it hurt. He pressed his hand gently against the glass. There she was, his little girl. All the nights he'd worked overtime to save for her college. All the mornings he'd walked her to the bus stop, rain or shine. All the quiet moments when she called him hero because he fixed her broken toy or found her lost dog or simply showed up when no one else did. Now he was the one who wasn't invited. The truth was, Robert hadn't told anyone about the cancer. Not Emily, not her fiancé, not even his closest friend. He didn't want to burden anyone. When the doctor told him 6 months, maybe a year, he'd nodded calmly and asked one question: how much would the treatment cost? When he heard the number, he laughed, not because it was funny, but because he already knew the answer. That same night, he looked at Emily's wedding catalog on the table, the dresses, the flowers, the venue she'd dreamed about. He closed the folder gently and whispered to himself, "She'll get her wedding, that's all that matters." So he stopped going to the clinic, stopped buying his medication. Every paycheck went into an account with her name on it. And now, standing outside that shining hall, he thought, it was worth it. Even if she'd forgotten him, even if he could only watch from the door. The reception, he knew, would be held later at the Belmont, the place she had always dreamed of. He had made sure she would have it, even if she never knew why. A breeze swept through the courtyard, lifting a few petals to his feet. Robert bent down, picked one up, white rose, soft as silk, and tucked it into his pocket. A keepsake. Inside, someone announced the father-daughter dance. He froze. For a second he thought maybe she'd call him in. But then through the glass he saw another man, her husband's father, take her hand. They laughed. The guests cheered. Robert stood perfectly still. No tears this time, just a quiet, hollow stillness. After a moment he whispered, almost to the wind, "She looks happy. That's what matters." When the music swelled again, he turned away from the door. The sun was setting now, and the courtyard was empty. He placed the small gift carefully on a bench near the entrance, the silver frame glinting under the orange light. On the back, a small note in shaky handwriting. "For Emily. So you'll always remember how proud I am of you, Dad." He stood there a moment longer, then walked down the path, slow and quiet. Behind him, the laughter grew louder and then faded with every step he took. Robert Hale never looked back. Not once. Because sometimes love isn't about being seen. It's about showing up even when no one opens the door. The diagnosis came on a Tuesday morning, the kind of morning that looked harmless, almost gentle, the kind where sunlight slipped through the blinds and made patterns on the kitchen counter. Robert was stirring his coffee when the phone rang. He almost didn't answer. "Mr. Hale," the doctor said, voice calm, too calm. "The results are back. You might want to come in." He knew right then. It wasn't the words. It was the tone, the pause that followed. The kind people use when they're about to tell you something they wish they didn't have to say. He went in that afternoon. He listened. He nodded. He smiled even when the doctor said cancer. It wasn't denial. It was habit, the same calm he'd used his whole life whenever something broke, a leaky faucet, a broken heart, a lost job. This too, he thought, could be fixed, until the doctor said stage 4. That night, he drove home in silence. The world outside his windshield blurred into streaks of light. He parked the truck in the driveway and just sat there, engine ticking softly, hands gripping the steering wheel long after the key was out. Inside, the house felt too quiet. Emily's laughter still lived in the walls somehow, faint echoes of a childhood that had slipped through his fingers faster than he realized. He sat at the kitchen table, the one with a small burn mark from her high school science project. He ran his fingers over it and smiled. Then slowly, he pulled the folded medical report from his jacket and set it down in front of him. He didn't cry. He just stared at the words until the letters blurred together. The next morning, he went to work as usual. No one could tell anything was wrong. He fixed pipes, changed filters, carried boxes, just another day at the hardware store. He even cracked jokes with the younger guys, the same way he always did. But every now and then, when no one was looking, he'd press a hand against his side where the pain pulsed like a dull reminder of the truth he was hiding. At lunch, he opened his old metal lunchbox and found a note, one Emily had left years ago, folded and yellowed from time. It read, "Good luck today, Dad, love you lots, E." He smiled. Then he put it back carefully like a charm. When he got home that evening, he called her. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, "how's the wedding planning going?" Emily's voice was bright and tired at the same time. "Oh, Dad, it's crazy. We're trying to book the venue, but everything's so expensive. Mark says we might need to downsize." Robert laughed softly. "You let me worry about that." "Dad, no, you've done enough," he cut her off gently. "It's your wedding, Emily. It should be perfect." There was a pause. "You sure?" "I'm sure." He could almost see her smile through the phone. After they hung up, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above him. Perfect. That word echoed. He wanted her day to be perfect, even if nothing else in his life could be anymore. A week later, his doctor called again. They talked about treatment plans, options, percentages, all numbers that meant hope to someone else, but not to him. "Robert," the doctor said, "if we start now, we can manage the pain, maybe slow it down." He looked out the window. The neighborhood kids were playing in the yard across the street, their laughter sharp and full of life. "How much?" he asked quietly. The doctor hesitated, then gave him a figure. Robert exhaled, slow and long. "I'll think about it," he said, but he already knew his answer. That weekend, he drove to the bank. He opened a new savings account in Emily's name. The teller, a woman about his daughter's age, smiled as she handed him the receipt. "Ending for the big day?" she asked. He nodded. "Something like that." He didn't tell her that he'd just signed away what could have been his last chance at another year, maybe two. But as he left, the air felt lighter somehow. It was as if choosing her over himself made the world make sense again. That night, he dug through an old box of photos. Pictures of birthdays, graduations, holidays, moments frozen in smiles and sunlight. He paused at one where Emily was 5, wearing a paper crown, holding a slice of cake too big for her hands. He just divorced her mother then, working double shifts to make rent. He'd missed the party but showed up at midnight with a balloon and a promise. "Next year I'll be there on time." He never missed another one. Now, looking at that photo, he whispered, "Next year you'll have your wedding." Then he closed the box as if sealing the vow inside. The days passed quietly. He went to work, came home, checked his pillbox but never refilled it. When the pain got worse, he pretended it was the weather. He started spending evenings on the porch, listening to the world wind down, neighbors' sprinklers hissing, dogs barking, the low hum of cars on the highway. It comforted him, the rhythm of ordinary life continuing as if nothing was wrong. Sometimes, when he closed his eyes, he'd picture Emily walking down the aisle. He imagined her face glowing under the lights, her smile steady and sure. He pictured himself sitting in the front row, trying not to cry. He never pictured a day where he wouldn't be there at all. One evening his friend Walter stopped by, an old coworker who noticed the limp, the paler skin. "You okay, Bobby?" Robert smiled faintly. "Just tired, too many pipes, not enough coffee." Walter squinted. "You should get yourself checked." Robert looked down at his hands, rough, cracked, stained from years of work, and said, "I already did." There was something in his tone that made Walter go quiet. They sat together on the porch until the sky turned dark. Neither of them said another word. Later that night, after Walter left, Robert stood by the window watching the porch light flicker. He pressed his palm against the glass. It was cool beneath his skin. He thought about Emily, about how she used to stand just like this, waiting for him to come home. Back then, she'd run to the door the moment his truck pulled in, shouting, "Daddy's home." And every time, no matter how tired he was, he'd lift her high into the air. He remembered her tiny arms around his neck, the smell of her hair, the way she whispered, "Don't ever leave, okay?" He whispered back into the dark, "I didn't, sweetheart. I never left." And in that quiet house, with the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the wall clock, Robert Hale made a promise no one else would ever hear. That whatever time he had left, he would spend it making sure his daughter's life began the way she always dreamed, even if it meant his own would quietly end. Emily's voice had changed. Not in tone, it was still warm, still lilting, but in pace. There was a rush to it now, a kind of breathless excitement that didn't pause for air. Every time Robert picked up the phone, she was already mid-sentence. "Dad, guess what? They have this new ballroom at the Belmont, with chandeliers like rain." Or, "Mark says his cousin can get us a discount on the wine, but I really want the imported one." He would listen, smiling, the receiver tucked against his shoulder while he scrubbed the same dish twice, the water long gone cold. He liked hearing her happy. That was all that mattered. But sometimes when she spoke, he could hear the distance, the kind that isn't about miles but about worlds. It had been years since she'd last lived under his roof. College had taken her to the city. Love had kept her there. Robert never said no to any of it. He was proud of how she built her life, proud she found someone to share it with. Still, when she came home for Sunday dinner, she always brought her world with her. The phone that never stopped buzzing, the fiancé who couldn't sit still, the talk of things Robert didn't understand, destination weddings, vegan menus, color palettes. That Sunday she sat at his small kitchen table, flipping through a glossy bridal magazine. "Look, Dad," she said, tapping a page. "That's the one. Lace sleeves, low back. Classic but not, old." Robert smiled. "It's beautiful, sweetheart." She turned another page, eyes wide. "And this, the floral archway. Mark says it's a bit pricey, but imagine the photos. It'll be like walking through heaven." Robert nodded. He imagined it, her walking through heaven, and the image caught in his throat for reasons she couldn't know. After dinner, she stayed to help clean up. The radio played something soft and forgettable. She hummed along out of tune. "Dad," she said suddenly, "I know weddings can be expensive. I don't want you stressing over it, okay? Mark and I can handle most of it." He rinsed a plate, pretending not to flinch at the word most. "Sweetheart," he said, "let me do something for you just once more." She laughed. "Dad, you've done enough. You don't have to. I want to." The room went quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet filled with love that didn't know where to go. Then she smiled, kissed his cheek, and whispered, "Okay, old man, but promise me you won't overdo it." He smiled back. "You know me." She did, or she thought she did. A few days later he found himself at the Belmont. He'd never been to a hotel that smelled like flowers before, not real ones, but some kind of perfume in the air that made every breath feel expensive. The wedding coordinator met him in the lobby, her clipboard polished like her smile. "Mr. Hale, you're here for the Hale-Patterson wedding consultation." He nodded. She led him through a maze of velvet chairs and marble floors, explaining package tiers and premium add-ons. He nodded through it all, pretending he understood what gold-tier linen upgrade meant. When she showed him the ballroom, he stopped. The light poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, bouncing off crystal chandeliers. It felt like standing inside a dream. He could see her there, Emily, walking across that floor, radiant, alive. He took out his checkbook. "I'll take it," he said. The coordinator blinked. "Would you like to discuss?" "No," he said gently. "She wants this one." He remembered Emily mentioning the Belmont after visiting the church earlier that week. She'd said it was where she wanted the reception to be. Now he understood why. That night he sat at his kitchen table again, pen hovering over the bills. Numbers never scared him. Life had always been a math problem he could work through. A job lost meant another shift. A broken car meant fewer dinners out. But this time there wasn't another equation waiting to save him. He added it all up, the venue deposit, the catering, the photographer, and saw what was left. Enough to live on for maybe 2 months. Maybe less. He stared at the total, then folded the paper neatly and slid it under the fridge magnet. Beside it was a photo of Emily at age 12, holding a science fair ribbon, eyes shining. He tapped the corner of the picture and whispered, "You always deserve the best, kiddo." The following weekend, Emily and Mark came by to show him color samples for the table settings. Mark talked a lot about budget, about themes, about how his parents were helping out a bit. He was polite, the way someone is polite to an older man they don't quite see as important. At one point, Mark turned to Robert and said, "Don't worry, sir. We've got this covered. You've done plenty already." Robert smiled and said, "That's good to hear." But inside, something small and quiet folded in on itself. He watched Emily laugh with Mark as they left, her arm looped through his, her head tilted toward the sky like she didn't have a single weight in the world. And for a moment, he felt proud that she had made it somewhere light years away from the small, cracked house where she grew up. Then he looked down at his hands, rough and spotted, and wondered how it felt to hold her as a baby and now not be needed to hold her at all. That night he couldn't sleep. The ceiling fan turned above him, a slow circle of whispering blades. He thought about calling her just to hear her voice again, to ask if she needed help with anything, but it was late. Instead, he got up, went to the small desk in the corner and opened a worn ledger. He began making a list. Venue, paid deposit. Catering due next month. Dress pending. At the bottom he wrote in neat, careful letters, treatment canceled. He paused, staring at the word. Then beneath it he added, worth it. A week later he received a text from Emily. "Dad, you're the best. I can't wait for you to walk me down the aisle." He read it over and over. The words glowed faintly in the dim light of his living room. He imagined her voice as he read it aloud, slow, almost reverent. "Walk me down the aisle," he whispered. The thought filled him with something too complicated to name: joy, fear, love, maybe all three tangled together. He set the phone down, leaned back and closed his eyes. The pain came and went like a tide, but for once it didn't bother him. He could see the picture clearly now, Emily in white, his hand on hers, her smile steady. He smiled too, just before drifting off to sleep. In the darkness, he whispered into the quiet air, "I'll get you there, sweetheart, no matter what it takes." The first time Robert truly felt the illness in his bones, he was standing in the grocery aisle. It came like a sudden crack in the rhythm of an ordinary day, a sharp ache behind his ribs, deep and low, like someone tightening a belt around his chest. He gripped the shopping cart and waited for it to pass. People moved around him, choosing cereal, milk, coffee, the small rituals of normal life, and for a brief moment he envied how easily they belonged to it. When the pain eased, he exhaled slowly, placed a carton of milk into the cart, and whispered to himself, "Not yet. Not today." He still had things to do. He still had a wedding to finish paying for. The next morning the phone rang just as he was buttoning his work shirt. He recognized the number, the clinic. For a second he thought about letting it ring out. Then he sighed and answered. "Mr. Hale," the nurse said gently, "the doctor's concerned you've missed your last few appointments." Robert glanced at the stack of invoices on his table. Beneath them was a small calendar marked with payment dates for the wedding vendors. He rubbed his temple and said, "Tell him I'm fine, just been busy." The nurse hesitated. "You know that's not how this works, right? The pain will." "I'll manage," he said, cutting her off. "There's a lot going on right now." When he hung up, the house felt smaller, like the air had thickened somehow. He poured coffee, but it tasted metallic, wrong. He dumped it out and tried not to notice how his hand trembled when he reached for the mug again. Later that week, his old friend Walter stopped by. Walter had been through enough years with him to recognize the signs, the forced smile, the slow way Robert sat down like gravity had doubled overnight. "You look pale, Bobby," Walter said, lowering himself into the chair across from him. "I'm fine," Robert replied automatically. Walter studied him for a moment. "You still seeing that doctor?" Robert gave a small laugh. "No sense paying a man to tell me what I already know." "Which is?" Robert looked out the window. The street outside was quiet, the afternoon sunlight fading into a pale gold. "That I've got a little time left," he said softly, "and I'd rather spend it right." Walter frowned. "You're talking like a man who's made peace," Robert said, cutting him off gently. "I'm not dying yet, Walt. I'm just living carefully." Walter didn't argue. There are moments when friendship knows better than to lecture. He just nodded and said, "You're stubborn as hell." Robert smiled faintly. Always have been. That night Robert found himself awake long after midnight. The house hummed softly, the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the faint whistle of wind through the cracks in the window frame. He couldn't sleep. He walked into the bathroom, turned on the light, and stared at himself in the mirror. His face had changed, thinner, paler, lines deeper around his mouth. He touched his cheek, then the place under his ribs where the ache always started. He remembered something the doctor had said, almost kindly. "If you start treatment soon, you could buy time, maybe a year, maybe more." Buy time. As if time were something that came with a receipt and a refund policy. He thought about how many bills he'd already paid, how many checks had for Emily written in the memo line. He whispered into the mirror, "I already bought something better." Then he switched off the light. A few days later, Emily called. Her voice was full of plans, table settings, flower arrangements, a honeymoon in Maui. She didn't ask how he was, and he didn't expect her to. "Dad, can you believe it's only 2 months away?" she said. "I can," he answered, smiling into the receiver. She laughed. "You sound tired. You working too hard again?" "Maybe a little," he said. "Don't overdo it. You have to look good for the wedding photos." He closed his eyes. The wedding photos. The words landed heavier than they should have. "I'll be there," he said quietly. "Don't you worry about me." When the call ended, he sat in silence, holding the phone to his chest. The quiet afterward was heavier than the conversation itself. He thought about telling her about the diagnosis, the pain, the fear, but the thought faded as quickly as it came. What would she do with that truth? She'd worry. She'd cry. She'd offer to cancel the wedding, and he couldn't let that happen. A week later, he met with the doctor one last time. The office smelled of antiseptic and faint lemon cleaner. The walls were covered with cheerful posters that tried too hard to be comforting. The doctor sighed when Robert walked in. "I was beginning to think you disappeared." Robert smiled. "Not yet. Sit down." The doctor went over charts, scans, numbers, all the things that spoke in a language Robert didn't need translated. Finally, the doctor looked up and said, "You're making this harder than it has to be. The treatments could give you time." Robert clasped his hands together. "I'm not sure I want borrowed time, Doc. I just want useful time." The doctor frowned. "There's nothing useful about dying early." Robert chuckled softly. "You'd be surprised." He stood up, shook the doctor's hand, and said, "Thank you for everything." And when the doctor tried to protest, Robert simply added, "You save people. That's your job. Mine's just different." Back home, he sat by the window again, the late afternoon light filtering through the blinds in soft stripes. He watched the dust drift in the air, small, aimless, golden. On the coffee table lay the treatment pamphlet, unopened. He picked it up once, thumbed the edge, then set it back down. He could feel his heartbeat under his ribs, slower these days, quieter. He leaned his head against the chair and closed his eyes. He thought about Emily's laughter, about her wedding dress, about the way she said "Dad" like it still meant something. Maybe it did. He pictured her walking down the aisle, her arm looped through his, and for a fleeting moment he imagined what it would feel like to be there, to see her glow. It was enough. When the clock struck 9, he folded the pamphlet neatly, placed it inside a drawer, and turned off the lamp. The house settled into stillness. Outside, the wind moved gently through the trees, carrying with it the scent of rain that never quite arrived. And in that quiet, Robert Hale made peace with what he wouldn't tell, not because he was afraid of dying, but because he didn't want the story of her beginning to carry the shadow of his ending. The envelope came on a Thursday, thin, white, and harmless looking. It sat on the edge of the kitchen table, among grocery flyers and old receipts, but something about it made Robert's stomach tighten. He already knew what it was. The final invoice from the Belmont. He poured himself a cup of coffee he didn't really want, sat down, and stared at it for a long time before opening it. When he finally did, the sound of tearing paper seemed louder than it should have been. Numbers spilled out across the page, long lines of them, stacked and merciless. He ran his thumb down the total and let out a low whistle. It was more than he expected, much more. Even after the deposit, even after what he'd already paid. He leaned back, the chair creaking under his weight. A headache pulsed behind his eyes, dull but steady. He folded the paper once, then again, and finally set it face down on the table, as if hiding the words could undo them. Outside, the rain started, soft at first, tapping against the windows, building into a steady rhythm. Robert watched it slide down the glass in crooked lines, catching the faint reflection of his face in the pane. He looked older that day, not by years, but by the kind of fatigue that comes when life keeps asking for pieces of you you don't have left to give. He stood up, walked to the counter, and picked up his checkbook. The familiar act, pen to paper, his name in careful loops, had always been simple, almost comforting. But this time, his hand paused halfway through. There wasn't enough, not even close. He set the pen down. The rain outside grew heavier, drumming on the roof like the sound of something closing in. Later that afternoon, he drove to the pawn shop at the edge of town. The air smelled faintly of oil and old wood, the kind of place where things came to rest when they no longer belonged anywhere else. He carried a small box with him, his watch, a few tools, and the ring his father had given him decades ago. The clerk, a man in his 30s with tired eyes, lifted each item one by one. "This ring's got some age," he said. "Real gold." Robert replied. "Once." The man waited, tapped a few keys on the register, and turned the screen toward him. Robert looked at the number. It was smaller than he'd hoped, but he nodded anyway. When he left the shop, the sky had cleared. The air smelled like wet pavement, metallic and clean. He slipped the cash into his wallet and whispered, "One more bill paid." That night he called Emily. He didn't mention the envelope or the pawn shop or the way his chest still ached when he walked up the stairs. Instead, he said, "Everything's coming together. You'll have your dream wedding." She squealed through the phone, "Dad, I can't believe it. You're sure it's not too much?" "I'm sure. You're amazing. Mark and I were just saying how lucky we are to have you." He smiled, even though she couldn't see it. "Lucky works both ways, sweetheart." They talked for a while about music, about flowers, about how she wanted fairy lights strung across the ceiling. When they hung up, the house felt too quiet again. He sat at the table, staring at the half-empty mug beside him, and for the first time he felt something close to anger, not at her, but at the world. At the cruel math of it all. How a man could give everything and still somehow come up short. The next morning he visited the bank. The manager, a young woman with careful hair and practiced sympathy, greeted him by name. "Mr. Hale," she said, "we can look into an extension if you'd like, maybe a short-term loan." He hesitated. He hated owing anyone. It was a pride thing, a quiet rule he'd lived by all his life. But pride didn't buy wedding cakes or flowers or happiness for the only person who ever made him feel like his life had meant something. So he signed the papers. The pen felt heavy in his hand. When it was done, the woman smiled and said, "You're all set. Congratulations to your daughter." "Thank you," he said softly. "She's the reason I'm still doing any of this." Back home, he sat on the porch with a folder of receipts on his lap. The evening sun cut long shadows across the yard. He went through each paper slowly, the caterer, the florist, the photographer, marking each one paid in neat, precise letters. When he reached the last page, his hand trembled slightly. He put the pen down and pressed his fingers against his temple. The ache in his side had grown worse these days, sharp enough to steal his breath if he moved too quickly. He closed his eyes and counted 1, 2, 3 until it passed. Then he whispered to himself, "Almost there, Bobby, just a little more." That night he found the envelope again, the one that had started it all. He smoothed it flat on the table, tracing the creases with his thumb. Then he took out the receipt from the bank, folded it neatly, and tucked it inside. A strange kind of satisfaction filled him, not joy, not relief, but the quiet peace of a man who'd kept his word. He poured himself a glass of water, drank half of it, and leaned back in his chair. The house creaked softly in the wind. He thought about the day ahead, the fittings, the seating charts, the small tasks that would keep him busy enough to forget what he was losing. He reached for the light switch, paused, and looked around the room one more time. The wedding plans covered the table, each page a piece of the life he was building for her. A life he wouldn't get to see unfold. He smiled faintly and said under his breath, "Every father pays a bill he can't afford. This one just came with interest." Then he turned off the light. And in the dark the rain began again, soft, steady, and patient, as if the sky itself was counting along with him, drop by drop, debt by debt, until there was nothing left to owe. It happened on a day that began like any other, quiet, ordinary, harmless. Robert had stopped by Emily's new place with a box of things she'd left behind years ago. Old books, a few photographs, her high school trophy for debate. He thought she might want to display them in her new home, to remember the girl she used to be before life started rushing her forward. The apartment complex was nicer than he'd expected. Manicured lawns, a pool that shimmered like glass, balconies draped with fairy lights. He stood in the parking lot for a moment, taking it all in, then carried the box to the door and knocked. No one answered. He waited, knocked again. Finally, he heard voices inside, laughter, the scrape of chairs, footsteps crossing the floor. Then Emily's voice, bright and quick, the same rhythm he'd memorized since she was little. He smiled, ready to call out. But something stopped him. A second voice, Mark's, low and firm. "Are you sure about this?" Robert froze, the box still in his arms. "I just think," Mark continued, "it might complicate things having him there." There was a pause, followed by the soft clink of glasses. "Complicate what?" Emily's tone was light but uncertain. Mark exhaled audibly. "The wedding, the pictures, the vibe, you know. I mean, your dad's not well." Robert felt his chest tighten. He pressed himself slightly closer to the door, as if the wood between them could explain itself. Emily said something he couldn't quite hear, her words muffled by the air. Then Mark again, firmer this time. "He looks sick, Em. People will notice, and I don't want you getting upset if something happens in the middle of the ceremony." There was a long silence. Then Emily's voice, quiet, careful. "He'll understand." The sound of that sentence broke something in him. Not because of the words themselves, but because she said them like a fact. A line rehearsed, resigned. He stood there motionless. His heart thudded, slow and heavy, like it was carrying too much. Inside, a chair scraped against the floor. Emily laughed, not the real laugh, not the one that started in her chest, but the polite, kind people make when they want to end a conversation. Robert took a step back. The box wobbled in his hands, and something inside, a picture frame, slid against the cardboard. He caught it before it fell, breathing hard, trying to steady himself. Then he placed the box gently on the ground beside the door. He didn't knock again. The drive home felt longer than usual. The radio was on, but he didn't hear it. The world outside the windshield blurred, streets, trees, headlights, a wash of color he couldn't focus on. At a red light, he glanced at his reflection in the side mirror. Mark wasn't wrong. He did look sick. His skin had thinned. His eyes were rimmed in shadows. His collar hung looser than it used to. He touched his jaw, felt the roughness of stubble, the fine tremor in his fingers. When the light turned green, he didn't move right away. A horn blared behind him, and he startled back into motion. At home, the air was still, heavy with the scent of rain-soaked wood. He walked straight to the kitchen, filled a glass of water, and stood at the sink without drinking. The water line shimmered at the rim, reflecting the small yellow light above. He finally took a sip, then set it down and leaned against the counter. He'd heard enough confessions in his life to know what people really meant when they said he'll understand. It was the phrase people used when they'd already made up their minds to hurt you. He rubbed his temples, the ache in his side pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He wasn't angry, not yet, just hollow. Later that evening he called her. She picked up on the second ring, her voice bright as ever. "Dad, hey, what's up?" Most asked. Almost said, "Do I still get to be there?" But the words caught somewhere between his throat and his pride. "Just wanted to check in," he said instead. "Make sure you got everything you need for Saturday's tasting." "I did. Mark and I went earlier." "Oh, Dad, it was perfect. They had this lemon cake with lavender frosting," and he smiled through the ache. "Sounds fancy." "It's all coming together," she said dreamily. "Can you believe it's really happening?" He could, though not the way she meant. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," he said. "I just hope it's everything you've ever wanted." "It will be," she said, and her voice lifted again, chasing away any trace of doubt. He listened, murmured agreement where needed, and when she laughed, he found himself laughing too. But when they hung up, the house fell into a silence so sharp it almost rang. He went to the hall closet and opened the top shelf. There, under an old blanket, was the box of wedding receipts. He took it down, sat on the floor, and began sorting through it, one invoice at a time, one promise after another. Each slip of paper was its own confession, the money spent, the hours worked, the corners cut. He told himself all along that every dollar was love made tangible. Now, staring at those papers, he wasn't sure what love looked like anymore. He found one receipt from the Belmont, final balance due, $4,870. Next to it, he'd written in neat blue ink, "Paid in full." He traced those words with his finger, then folded the paper and slipped it back into the envelope. Outside, the wind rose, rattling the window panes. He turned off the lights, leaving only the small lamp by the sofa. Its glow spilled across the room, soft, uneven, catching dust in the air. He sank into the chair, his body weary, and stared at the door. He imagined her standing on the other side of it again, smiling, saying, "Dad, I'm sorry. Mark didn't mean it." But she wouldn't. She'd already decided that silence was easier than guilt. He leaned back, folded his arms, and whispered into the dimness, "I'll still pay the bill." The words hung there, fragile and final, and for the first time, Robert Hale felt the quiet crack of something he'd spent a lifetime building. The faith that love, if given enough, would always find its way back. The mail came late that Thursday, the kind of gray afternoon where time felt slow, stretched thin by the weight of waiting. Robert had been watching the mailbox for days now, the way a sailor watches the horizon for a ship that might never arrive. Every sound, the truck's brakes, the clink of the mailbox door, stirred something small inside him. He opened the door, stepped out, and waited for the mail carrier to finish her rounds. She smiled at him the way people smile at familiar strangers, kind, distant, not curious. "Afternoon, Mr. Hale," she said, handing him the small stack of envelopes. He took them carefully, his heart quickening despite himself. There were bills, a grocery flyer, a letter from the utility company, but no invitation. He flipped through again, slower this time, as if it might appear if he just looked hard enough. Nothing. He forced a breath, smiled politely, and thanked her before heading back inside. The door shut with a sound that echoed through the quiet house, too sharp for such a small space. He laid the envelopes on the table and stared at them. The kitchen clock ticked behind him, steady and indifferent. He tore open the electric bill, pretending that was what he'd been waiting for. But his eyes kept drifting to the empty space beside it, the space where the invitation should have been. A cream envelope with embossed lettering, maybe. Her name, Emily Patterson now, printed in elegant gold. He imagined the card inside, the photo of her and Mark smiling beneath fairy lights. He tried to picture what it would have said. "Mr. Robert Hale, you are warmly invited to celebrate the wedding of..." He could almost hear her voice reading it aloud. And then, like a thread snapped, the sound in his mind disappeared. That night he called her. It rang longer than usual before she picked up. "Hey, Dad." Her voice was light, too bright, like the practiced tone of someone trying to sound normal. "Hey, sweetheart," he said, "just checking in, thought maybe I'd get some mail today." She hesitated just enough that he noticed. "Oh yeah," she said quickly, "the invitations, they went out last week." He waited, nothing else came. "I guess mine got lost along the way," he said, trying to keep it light. She let out a soft laugh that didn't belong to her. "Yeah, maybe, the post office has been crazy lately." He nodded, though she couldn't see it. "Well," he said after a moment, "as long as I know when to show up." There was another pause, this one longer, harder to fill. "Dad," she said quietly, "Mark and I were talking, we think maybe it's better if you just..." He felt the air leave his chest before she finished. "If you just rest that day. It's going to be a long event, a lot of people, a lot of moving around, you shouldn't push yourself." He said nothing. The silence stretched until she added, softer now, "I just don't want you to be uncomfortable, you've done so much already." He closed his eyes. "Uncomfortable," he repeated, the word tasting strange in his mouth. "Dad, no, it's all right," he said gently. "You're probably right." She exhaled, relief and guilt tangled together. "I knew you'd understand." He smiled, though it hurt. "I always do." They talked a little longer, or rather she talked and he listened. She described the rehearsal dinner, the playlist, how beautiful the flowers were going to be. He said all the right things, the way fathers do when love asks them to hide their hurt. When she hung up, he kept the phone pressed to his ear until the line went dead. He didn't sleep that night. He sat in his armchair, a thin blanket over his knees, the glow from the streetlight seeping through the curtains. The phone sat on the table beside him. Every so often, he'd glance at it, half expecting her to call back and say she'd changed her mind. But the hours passed, quiet and merciless. He looked around the room, the framed pictures on the wall, the one of her at graduation, smiling at him with eyes full of a gratitude he used to believe would last forever. Now the glass caught the light wrong and her face looked distant, almost ghost-like. He stood, walked over and straightened the frame. Then he whispered, "I'll still be there, sweetheart, even if you don't see me." The next morning he drove to the print shop in town. The clerk looked up from the counter as Robert placed a USB drive on the table. "I need one photo printed," he said. The man nodded and pulled up the image, an old picture of Emily at age 7, sitting on Robert's shoulders, her hands clasped above his head, both of them laughing at something just out of frame. "Color or black and white?" the clerk asked. "Black and white," Robert said. "It lasts longer." When the print was ready, he held it for a moment before sliding it into an envelope. Then on the front he wrote in careful letters, "For Emily, for the day you dreamed of." He didn't add a return address. At home he found himself setting the table for two out of habit, a quiet ritual that made no sense but somehow steadied him. 2 plates, 2 glasses, the salt and pepper shakers lined up neatly. He poured himself a glass of water, sat down and folded his hands. He thought about what it meant to raise a child, how it was a lifetime of saying yes when it cost you something, of smiling when you wanted to break. He took a sip, then whispered, "You did good, kiddo, even if I don't get to see it." Outside, the evening settled in slow. The world went soft at the edges as if it too was holding its breath. And somewhere between the ticking clock and the distant sound of rain returning, Robert Hale came to understand that love, real love, sometimes asks you to stand outside the celebration and keep watching anyway. The morning broke clear and bright, the kind of morning that feels too beautiful for what it's about to hold. Robert woke before dawn, the light still pale and thin against the curtains. He lay there for a long time, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the silence between. He hadn't planned to go. He told himself he wouldn't. But as the minutes slipped by, the thought of her walking down that aisle alone, without him there, clawed at something deep inside. So he got up. He showered, shaved carefully, nicking his chin once. He smiled at the sight of it, a small cut like the body reminding him it was still there, still fighting for a few more moments. He put on his only suit, dark gray and slightly loose around the shoulders now, the same one he'd worn to her college graduation. The tie took him 3 tries. By the 4th, he gave up and let it hang imperfectly. "Good enough," he muttered to the mirror. Before leaving, he reached for the small box on his dresser, the silver frame he'd bought months ago. Inside it, a photo of Emily as a child on her first day of school. Her hair was wild, her smile wide enough to fill the room. He slipped the frame into a paper bag, then paused, resting his hand on the dresser to catch his breath. The pain came again, sudden and deep. He closed his eyes, breathed through it, and whispered, "Not today. Just let me get through today." The drive to the Belmont took longer than he expected. Traffic moved slow through town, and he found himself caught between wedding day limousines and polished sedans, all heading the same direction. He kept to the right lane, window cracked just enough to let the autumn air in. When he turned into the venue, his hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. The parking lot was already full, cars gleaming like polished stones under the morning sun. He parked near the back, where the gravel met a line of trees. From there, he could see the main hall, draped in soft white fabric, the doors open wide to welcome the guests he wasn't one of. He stepped out, smoothed his jacket, and began walking. The closer he got, the louder everything became, laughter, the faint buzz of music, the swell of voices carried on the wind. He stopped just before the steps, watching. Bridesmaids in pastel dresses fluttered like butterflies between the doors. Guests posed for photos beneath the archway of flowers he'd helped pay for. And there she was, Emily, at the top of the stairs, her veil caught in the breeze, her smile bright and easy. For a moment everything stopped. She looked radiant. It was the word people used in magazines, but it didn't come close. She looked alive. He took a step forward instinctively before realizing where he was, that he wasn't meant to be seen here. He lingered on the edge of the crowd, close enough to feel the warmth of celebration but far enough to be invisible. Then a hand landed on his shoulder. "Excuse me, sir," a voice said, polite, firm. He turned to see a man in a black suit, a security guard by the door. "This area's for guests only." Robert hesitated. "I'm her father." The man shifted uneasily. "Do you have an invitation, sir?" Robert blinked. "No, but I understand," the guard interrupted softly, "but we have to keep the entrance clear." He felt the words like a punch to the chest. The guard wasn't cruel, if anything he looked sorry, but that made it worse somehow. Robert nodded slowly. "Of course. I'll stay out of the way." He stepped back down the path, his shoes crunching softly against the gravel. At the edge of the courtyard, he found a bench half hidden behind a row of potted trees. From there he could still see her, framed by the open doors. The music began. He watched as the guests turned, as Emily took her first step down the aisle. Her arm was looped through another man's, Mark's father, perhaps tall, proud, smiling like he belonged there. Robert's breath caught. He told himself it didn't matter who walked beside her as long as she was happy, but the lie trembled in his throat. The ceremony was a blur of color and sound, vows, laughter, the clinking of glasses. He couldn't hear the words clearly, only fragments carried by the wind. Forever, honor, love. Each one felt heavier than the last. He sat there until the applause came, loud, joyful, unrestrained. Then the music swelled again and the guests began to spill out into the courtyard, glasses of champagne glinting in their hands. Someone brushed past him without noticing. Another man bumped his shoulder, mumbled an apology, kept walking. He looked down at his hands, folded tightly in his lap, and realized he was gripping the small paper bag. The frame inside pressed against his palm, its corner digging into his skin. He took it out, looked at the photo one last time, and smiled. The edges of his vision blurred a little, not from tears, but from the exhaustion that had become part of him. When the newlyweds came outside, cameras flashing, Robert stood quietly beneath the shade of a nearby tree. He didn't want to ruin anything, didn't want to be the story whispered about later. He just wanted to see her happy. And she was. God, she was. Her laughter rang out, bright and unguarded. He watched her toss the bouquet, watched the petals scatter in the air like pieces of the life he'd once built for her. And then, just as she turned, for the briefest second, her eyes caught something in the distance. He froze. She squinted toward the edge of the courtyard. For a moment their eyes met, or maybe he only imagined it. Then someone called her name and she turned away. He stayed until the sun began to lower behind the trees, long shadows stretching across the pavement. Guests drifted toward the reception hall, their voices fading into laughter and song. Robert took a slow breath, steadying himself. He walked to the bench by the entrance and placed the photo frame there, setting it upright against the wood. Then he whispered, "For luck." Before leaving, he looked back once more, at the lights flickering on, at the world inside that door where his name no longer fit. And as he walked away, the air cooled, the sky deepened to gold, and his reflection caught faintly in the window, a tired man in a borrowed suit, smiling at a wedding he wasn't meant to attend. He turned from it, the sound of music following him down the path like a ghost, and somewhere deep inside, the last thread between hope and heartbreak quietly gave way. The reception had begun by the time Robert made it back to the courtyard. He stood near the edge of the building, close enough to hear the music but far enough to be mistaken for a passerby. The sun had dropped below the trees and the light from the hall spilled out in golden rectangles across the gravel. He could see people moving inside, shadows and color and motion, laughter carried through the open windows. He hesitated for a long time before stepping closer. The glass was warm beneath his fingertips. He leaned slightly, just enough to look through. Inside, it was another world. The chandeliers glowed like stars caught in glass, and the tables shimmered with silverware and wine glasses. Every detail was perfect, exactly the way she'd wanted it. And there she was. Emily stood at the center of it all, the crowd orbiting around her. Her dress glowed soft under the lights, her hair shimmered when she turned. Someone handed her a microphone and she laughed, that same bright, unstoppable laugh he used to hear from the kitchen when she told stories over dinner. He smiled at first without realizing it. That sound, it still did something to him, but then she began to speak. "Thank you all for being here," she said, her voice clear and proud. "Mark and I couldn't have done any of this without your love and support." Applause filled the room. She continued, thanking friends, relatives, even Mark's co-workers. Robert waited for his name, a mention, a word, even just "my father." It never came. Her voice wavered slightly as she said, "And finally, thank you to everyone who stood by us through this journey. We're so grateful." Everyone clapped again. Robert's smile faded. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He just stood there, one hand on the window frame, the other gripping the small paper bag that held her photograph. For a moment, the room blurred. Not from tears, his eyes had forgotten how to produce them, but from the dull ache pressing at the back of his skull. He looked at her face, radiant in the light, and thought, maybe she just forgot. It was a fragile thought, a lie dressed as mercy. A waiter brushed past him outside, carrying a tray of empty glasses toward the kitchen. Robert stepped aside, murmured a quiet apology. The man glanced at him, hesitated. "You all right, sir?" Robert nodded, "just catching my breath." The waiter looked at him a second longer, then gave a small nod and moved on. When the door swung open, a burst of laughter and music followed, spilling out into the night air. Then it shut again, leaving only the faint echo of joy behind. Robert turned back to the window. Inside, Emily and Mark had begun their first dance. The music softened, a slow, familiar tune. He recognized it immediately. "Here Comes the Sun." He almost laughed. That song, their song, the one she used to hum when she was little, when she stood barefoot on the kitchen floor, insisting the world was always going to get better. He had told her then, "If that song ever plays at your wedding, I'll know you're happy." And here it was, her happiness, just out of reach. He rested his forehead gently against the glass. The coolness steadied him. The sound of the song drifted through, muffled like music underwater. He could see her twirling, her dress catching the light like water. Mark's hand on her waist, the way her head rested against his shoulder. It was a beautiful picture, almost too beautiful. He whispered, "You did it, sweetheart." But his voice cracked somewhere in the middle, turning into a breath instead. The air outside grew colder. He could feel the ache spreading through his chest, deep and rhythmic, like the body reminding him of its limits. He sat down on the stone ledge beneath the window, trying to gather himself. From this angle, the reflections of the lights shimmered across the glass. Inside, people were raising their glasses for a toast. He caught fragments of a speech, words like future, hope, forever. He thought of all the toasts he'd made in his life, birthdays, graduations, small victories. Each one had been for her. Each one had carried the same silent promise: "You'll never face this world alone." Now, watching her surrounded by people who didn't know his name, he wondered if promises could expire without anyone noticing. After a while, the music changed again, louder now, quicker. Guests filled the dance floor. Robert stood and took a few steps backward, afraid someone inside might notice him lingering. From where he stood, he could see the reflection of himself in the glass. An older man in an ill-fitting suit, face pale in the dim light. Behind that reflection, his daughter laughing in someone else's arms. It was almost poetic, two worlds separated by a pane of glass, both visible, neither reachable. He reached into his pocket, took out a folded napkin from the bench earlier. With slow, careful movements, he wiped a small circle on the fogged window, just enough to see clearly again. Then he whispered to the night, "That's close enough." When the song ended, he took one last look. The crowd clapped, the couple kissed, flashes went off from every corner. It was the happiest moment of her life, and he was there for it, even if she never knew. He stepped back, letting the shadows take him. His breath left small clouds in the cold air. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, a car door slammed. The world, indifferent as ever, kept moving. He turned toward the parking lot, the lights of the reception glowing behind him like a story he'd finished reading but couldn't quite close. Halfway to the car, he stopped. He looked back once more at the window, at the flickering light within, and said softly, "Good night, Emily." Then he walked into the dark, the glass behind him still reflecting both worlds, one filled with laughter and one with quiet. The night had turned cold by the time Robert made his way around to the side of the building. The music still pulsed faintly through the walls, low, steady, the sound of joy that wasn't meant for him. He found a spot near the kitchen entrance, where the staff came and went carrying trays, laughter, and the smell of roasted chicken mixed with champagne. He wasn't sure why he didn't leave. Maybe it was the thought that this would be the last time he'd see her, moving, alive, wrapped in light. Maybe he just wasn't ready to face the silence waiting for him back home. He lowered himself onto a short concrete ledge beside the service door, careful with his breathing. His ribs protested the motion. He pressed a hand against his chest until it eased. Above him, the stars were faint, washed out by the glow of the reception hall. He thought about how different the night sky looked when she was little, when they'd drive out to the lake just to watch the constellations appear. She'd point to every bright one, asking him to make up stories about them. He always did. "You see that one?" he'd say, tracing a line with his finger. "That's the father star, the one who stays up just to make sure the others don't fall." He smiled at the memory now, though it hurt more than it comforted. The service door opened suddenly, and a young man stepped out, balancing a tray of used glasses. He froze when he saw Robert sitting there in the half-light. "Oh, I'm sorry, sir," he said quickly. "Didn't mean to startle you." Robert waved a hand. "You didn't." The young man hesitated, unsure. "Are you one of the guests?" Robert thought about the question, then shook his head. "No, just someone passing through." The man nodded, not prying. He set his tray down on a nearby table and stretched his arms. It was clear he'd been working for hours. His white shirt clung to him, his shoes scuffed. "Long night?" Robert asked. The man smiled tiredly. "They always are. Weddings are happy, but behind the scenes it's chaos. You wouldn't believe how much food people waste." Robert chuckled softly. "I believe it." There was a small silence. The young man studied him, his brow furrowing just slightly. "You look cold, sir. Want some water, maybe coffee?" Robert started to refuse, then paused. "Water would be nice, thank you." The man disappeared through the door. When he returned, he handed Robert a glass filled halfway, condensation glistening down the side. "Here," he said, "it's clean from the staff jug." Robert took it carefully. "Appreciate that." He drank slowly, feeling the coolness slip down his throat, grounding him. "You sure you're all right?" the man asked after a moment. "You look a bit pale." Robert smiled faintly. "I'm fine, just tired, been a long day." The man nodded, not convinced but polite enough not to press. He leaned against the wall beside him, listening to the muffled music coming from inside. After a while he said, "My dad never made it to my sister's wedding. Heart attack a week before. My mom said he'd have loved it though. She cried through the whole ceremony." Robert glanced at him, the corners of his mouth lifting gently. Then he was still there. The man looked puzzled. "What do you mean?" "Love doesn't stop just because someone's gone," Robert said softly. "Sometimes the ones who aren't in the room, they are the reason it even exists." The man was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded, his throat working to swallow something unspoken. "Yeah, I like that." A door opened behind them, and the sudden light from inside spilled out into the small courtyard. Voices echoed, laughter, clinking glasses, the beginning of another toast. A man looked back toward the noise and said, "They're cutting the cake soon. You sure you don't want to go in? Nobody would stop you." Robert shook his head. "I think it's better this way." The man studied him, realizing something but choosing not to name it. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded napkin and offered it to Robert. "Here," he said, "in case you need it." Robert accepted it with a smile. "You're a good man." The young man shrugged. "Just raised right." He paused, then added, "Whoever you're here for, I hope they know you came." Robert looked at the window again, that glowing world behind glass, and said quietly, "Maybe someday they will." The man lingered a bit longer, unsure whether to leave. Finally, he picked up his tray. "Take care of yourself, sir." Robert nodded. "You too." When the door closed behind him, the night felt different, not less lonely, but somehow gentler. He looked down at the napkin, still warm from the man's hand. A small act of fleeting kindness, yet it felt enormous. He folded it neatly, placed it beside him on the ledge, and leaned back against the wall. The pain in his chest had dulled to a steady throb. He focused on his breathing, slow, deliberate, as the music inside shifted into something softer, almost wistful. Through the narrow window he could see Emily again, her hair loose now, her shoes off, laughing as she danced with her friends. Her face glowed in the warm light. For a moment it almost felt like he was seeing her through time. Not the bride she had become, but the little girl spinning barefoot in their old living room. He smiled to himself. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves behind him, carrying the faint smell of cake and roses. He thought of the young waiter, of his quiet decency, his simple gesture, and realized that sometimes the universe sent you small reminders that goodness still existed, even when everything else had gone wrong. He whispered, barely audible, "Thank you." He didn't know who it was for, the stranger, the night, or life itself, but the words felt right. He sat there until the music began to fade, until laughter turned to the low murmur of goodbyes, until even the stars seemed to dim. And when he finally stood, his knees stiff, the glass of water half finished beside him, he looked back toward that glowing hall and said softly, "She looks happy. That's enough." Then he turned, the napkin still in his pocket, a small reminder that even on the loneliest nights, a stranger's kindness could keep a man standing a little longer than he thought he could. By the time the last song faded, and the laughter began to drift toward the parking lot, Robert could feel his body giving out in quiet, invisible ways. It wasn't sudden, more like a slow unraveling. The ache that had lived in his bones for months now moved differently, spreading in waves that stole his breath a little more each time. He told himself he'd rest in the car, just a few minutes before driving home, but even as he stood from the bench, his knees shook under him. The world tilted slightly, and the lights around the courtyard blurred at the edges. He reached out to steady himself on the wall, the cold stone rough beneath his palm. He waited for the dizziness to pass, but it didn't. Instead, a sharp pain cut through his ribs, deep and sudden, as if something inside had snapped. He gasped, the sound small, swallowed by the night. The music from the hall had stopped now. The hum of conversation faded. The silence pressed closer, heavier. He sank back onto the ledge, chest rising too fast. He tried to breathe through it, slow in, slow out, but the air wouldn't cooperate. His vision flickered, each blink dimmer than the one before. He closed his eyes, whispering to himself, not here, not yet. Somewhere nearby, a door opened. Footsteps hurried across the courtyard, quick, light, purposeful. "Sir." A voice called. It was the young waiter from earlier. His face appeared in the soft yellow light spilling through the door, eyes widening when he saw Robert slumped forward, one hand clutching his chest. "Sir Hay, stay with me." Robert tried to speak, but his voice came out in a ragged whisper. "Just tired." The young man crouched beside him. "You don't look tired, you look sick. I'm calling an ambulance." Robert's hand shot out weakly, catching his sleeve. "Don't," he rasped. "It's fine. I just need a minute." But the young man was already dialing, his voice sharp now, urgent. "Yes, emergency services. There's a man outside the Belmont Hotel, older, maybe 60s. He's having trouble breathing." Robert turned his face away, embarrassed by the attention. He didn't want anyone making a scene. Not tonight, not here. He could still hear laughter faintly in the distance, the wedding party moving toward their cars, a woman's heels clicking against the stone. He imagined Emily somewhere in that crowd, hand in hand with her new husband, glowing in her happiness. And a strange calmness crept in. He didn't want her to see him like this. He didn't want her last memory of him to be this fragile, this broken. The sirens arrived sooner than he expected, distant at first, then growing closer, slicing through the still night air. Red and blue light flashed against the white walls of the hall, painting the scene in strange, shifting colors. Two paramedics rushed toward him, their movements brisk, voices clipped. "How long has he been like this?" one asked. "Just found him," the waiter replied, stepping back but refusing to leave. They spoke to Robert, asking questions he barely registered. He nodded to some, ignored others. All he could focus on was the sound, the static of the radio, the rustle of latex gloves, the quiet command of people used to saving others. When they lifted him onto the stretcher, the world tilted again. The night sky above him blurred, the stars faint behind the flashing lights. He caught a glimpse of the hall windows, golden, glowing, still full of laughter. The paramedic leaned close. "Can you tell me your name, sir?" "Robert," he managed. "Robert Hale." "Okay, Robert. We're going to take care of you, all right? Just hang in there." He tried to nod, but the motion was small. The pain had dulled into something distant now, like a storm heard from far away. The drive to the hospital was a blur of sound and light. He drifted in and out, flashes of ceiling panels, the steady beeping of machines, the murmur of voices saying words he couldn't hold on to. Somewhere in that haze he felt a hand squeeze his lightly. The waiter's voice, soft but certain. "You're gonna be okay, sir. Just breathe, you're almost there." Robert wanted to thank him, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he mouthed something, maybe thank you, maybe tell her I saw. He wasn't sure if the boy understood. The ambulance hit a small bump, and his head turned toward the window. The city lights streaked by in ribbons of gold and white. He watched them blur together until they looked like the reflection of a wedding he wasn't invited to. And in that strange quiet between one heartbeat and the next, he thought about the bills still sitting on his kitchen table, the suit hanging in his closet, photograph he'd left on the bench outside the hall. Everything he owned now lived somewhere between those things, the proof of a life that had been simple, imperfect, but his. He closed his eyes, the rhythm of the road steady beneath him. When they reached the hospital, the world exploded into motion again, voices shouting, doors swinging open, bright lights overhead. Someone said stage 4 and collapse in the same sentence. Another voice, calm, professional, said, "He's critical." He felt hands on him again, the prick of something cold entering his arm. He wanted to tell them to stop, that it wasn't worth it, that he'd already made his peace. But the words never made it past his lips. Instead, he thought of Emily's face, not as the bride, but as the little girl in the pink raincoat who once fell asleep on his shoulder during a thunderstorm. He remembered how small she was, how she'd fit perfectly against him. And how, even in sleep, she'd whispered, "Don't go anywhere, Daddy." His breath hitched. He smiled faintly. "I didn't," he murmured. Then everything went still. The paramedic beside him leaned over, calling his name again and again, the sound echoing down the sterile hall. But Robert Hale was already far away, in a memory where rain tapped gently on a car roof and a small voice called him home. The morning after the wedding smelled like wilted flowers and cold coffee. Emily woke to sunlight pouring through the blinds, too bright, too honest. Her head ached, her makeup still faintly smudged from the night before. Mark was asleep beside her, one arm flung over his face, his tuxedo jacket tossed across a chair. For a moment she smiled, the quiet after the storm, the stillness of finally. Then, somewhere in that silence, came the flicker of something she couldn't name, a weight, subtle at first, pressing lightly at the back of her chest. She got up, wrapped herself in the hotel robe and walked to the window. The parking lot below was half empty now. Balloons clung to the railing by the hall entrance, a few napkins scattered across the pavement like ghosts of laughter. It was over. All that planning, the colors, the flowers, the perfection done. And still she couldn't shake the feeling that something had been missing. Her phone buzzed on the table. A notification, one new message. It wasn't from her father. For a second she realized she hadn't thought of him at all yesterday, not once, not until this moment. She tried to remember if anyone had mentioned him, if anyone had noticed his absence. They hadn't. She told herself it was fine. He'd wanted her to be happy. He'd said so more than once. But even as she repeated it, it didn't sound right. She scrolled through her photos from the night, the smiles, the toasts, her glowing beneath the lights, but every image seemed to have a hollow space in it, a missing outline. When Mark stirred awake, she turned off the screen and slipped the phone into her pocket. "Hey," he murmured, "you okay?" She nodded, "Just tired." He smiled sleepily. "Yesterday was perfect, huh?" She forced a small laugh. "Yeah, perfect." By noon they were back at the venue to collect a few things. The staff were clearing tables, folding linens, sweeping petals off the floor. The place looked smaller now, stripped of its magic, bare under the daylight. Emily wandered outside while Mark talked to the coordinator. She wanted air. The scent of roses and champagne still clung to the breeze. That was when she saw it. Near the bench by the entrance, half hidden beneath a cluster of leaves, was a small paper bag. It looked oddly deliberate, placed rather than dropped. She hesitated before picking it up. Inside was a silver frame, simple, slightly tarnished around the edges. The photo inside made her breath catch. It was her, maybe 7 or 8 years old, sitting on her father's shoulders. Her hair messy, her cheeks sunburned from summer, both of them laughing at something just out of frame. The edges of the photo were worn, as if someone had carried it for years. Her knees went weak. She sat down on the bench, still holding the frame. On the back, in his handwriting, uneven, familiar, were 6 words. "For Emily, so you'll always remember." Her throat tightened. For a long minute she couldn't breathe. "Emily?" Mark called from behind her. "You ready?" She didn't answer. He walked closer, glanced down at the frame. "Oh, that's sweet. Did someone leave it?" She swallowed hard. "My dad." Mark frowned. "Your dad was here." She nodded slowly, the realization unraveling as she said it aloud. He was here. She stood, scanning the empty courtyard, the trees, the gravel path, the glass doors. And suddenly she remembered the faint flicker of movement she'd seen near the window last night. The shadow she'd thought was her reflection. It wasn't. Her chest tightened. He was here. The words came again, softer now, almost breaking. They drove home in silence. Mark tried to make small talk about the honeymoon, the photos, the thank you notes, but she wasn't listening. Every turn of the road felt heavier. When they reached their apartment, she went straight to her bag, searching for her phone. She opened their text thread. The last message he'd sent was 3 days ago. "Proud of you, kiddo. Can't wait to see you walk down that aisle." She hadn't replied. She'd been too busy choosing centerpieces. Her hands trembled as she typed a new message. "Dad, I'm sorry, I didn't mean." She stopped. The words blurred. She deleted them, typed again. "Where are you? Please call me." She hit send. The call came the next morning. A hospital. A calm voice asking if she was related to a Mr. Robert Hale. For a moment she couldn't speak. When the woman repeated the question, Emily heard herself answer, "I'm his daughter." There was a pause. Then the words she would remember for the rest of her life. "He passed away last night." The rest of the call dissolved into noise, explanations, condolences, procedures. She barely heard any of it. Her hands went cold, her phone slipping from her grip and landing softly on the carpet. Mark rushed over, asking questions, his voice a blur. She couldn't look at him. All she could see was that photograph, her small hands on her father's shoulders, face tilted toward the sun. The weight of every choice she'd made came crashing down in silence, every excuse. Every time she'd told herself he'd understand, she understood now. That afternoon she sat at their dining table, the frame before her. The sunlight hit the glass just right, and for a second she could almost see him again, the way he'd look at her when she was little, patient, proud. Her voice cracked as she whispered, "You were there, weren't you? You came anyway." The clock ticked faintly in the background. She waited for the air to answer, for anything to shift. Nothing did. She leaned forward, resting her forehead against the edge of the frame, her tears blurring the silver border. It was the first time she'd cried all day, the kind of crying that had no sound, only tremors. Through it, she remembered his last words from their call a week before. "I'll be there, sweetheart. Don't you worry about me." And for the first time, she understood what he meant. He hadn't been promising to walk her down the aisle. He'd been promising to stay in whatever way he still could. The realization split something open in her, grief and love entwined until she couldn't tell them apart. She lifted the frame gently, kissed the corner of the glass, and whispered, "I remember, Dad. I always will." Outside, the wind moved softly through the curtains, stirring the faint scent of roses she'd brought home from the wedding. It felt for just a breath like he was there again, quiet, proud, watching from a distance, just as he always had. Funeral was small. Smaller than Emily thought it would be. A few of her father's old co-workers, a neighbor from down the street, and Walter, the man who'd known him since forever, who kept calling her kiddo like her father once did. The chapel smelled faintly of lilies and rain. It was the kind of quiet that pressed against your skin, the kind that made you aware of every breath, every heartbeat. Emily sat in the front row, clutching the folded note the hospital had given her, personal belongings enclosed. Inside were his wallet, his watch, and a single envelope with her name on it. She hadn't opened it yet. She couldn't. The service began, words about peace and rest and heaven. She heard them, but they slid past her weightless. What she saw instead was the image of him standing outside the wedding hall, alone, watching through the window. She didn't know how she knew it, but she could see it clearly now, his quiet patience, his proud, tired smile. The image clung to her like a memory she hadn't lived but somehow remembered. When the pastor asked if anyone wanted to speak, Walter stood. His voice was rough around the edges, honest. "Bob was a simple man," he began. "Didn't ask for much, worked hard, gave everything he had to one person, his daughter, you." He turned slightly toward her, his eyes kind but steady. "He talked about you all the time, Emily. Said you were his reason for getting up in the morning. Said he wanted your life to be bigger than his. That's how he saw love, not something you keep, but something you give away until there's nothing left." Emily's eyes blurred. Her throat closed around a sound she couldn't release. When the service ended, she stayed long after everyone else had gone. The chapel emptied until only the creak of the pews and the soft hum of the rain remained. She looked down at the envelope in her lap, to Emily, written in his careful, looping handwriting. Her name looked smaller somehow, like he'd written it with a shaking hand. She opened it slowly. "My Emily, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't keep my promise to walk you down the aisle. I'm sorry for that. I really am. But if I'm honest, sweetheart, I think you walked yourself there long before that day. You always have. When your mom passed, I remember worrying how I'd raise you alone. I didn't know how to braid hair or make birthday cakes that didn't collapse in the middle. But you never made me feel like I wasn't enough. You'd pat my hand and say, 'It's okay, Dad, we're learning together.' And we did. That's what life is, a long, messy class where love is the only subject worth failing at a few times. I know we drifted. It happens. You built a new world, and I was proud to see you do it. But somewhere in all the noise, I think I forgot to tell you the one thing that mattered most. You never owed me anything. Not time, not gratitude, not even a seat at your wedding. Everything I gave, the money, the house, the years, those were gifts I wanted to give. Because that's what fathers do. They build a life for their children brick by brick until one day they realize they've built it so well that there's no room left for themselves. And that's okay. That's how it's supposed to end. If I seem tired near the end, don't remember me that way. Remember me at the lake teaching you how to skip stones. Remember me clapping too loud at your school play. Remember the time you fell asleep on my shoulder and said I made the best pancakes in the world, even though we both knew they were burnt. Those are the parts of me I want you to keep. Not the hospital visits, not the coughing, just those small, ordinary moments that somehow added up to a whole life. And when the day comes, maybe years from now, when you have a child of your own and you feel that fierce, frightening love that keeps you awake at night, I want you to remember something. You'll understand me then, completely. Until that day, just know this: I never stopped being proud of you, not once. Even when I was standing outside the window, with all the love I have left, Dad. The paper trembled in her hands. Tears blurred the ink, smudging his signature until it looked like a fingerprint. She pressed it to her chest, shaking silently, the weight of his words breaking something open and gentle inside her. For a long time she didn't move. She just sat there, her father's voice echoing through the quiet room. When she finally stood, the rain had stopped. A sliver of light cut through the clouds, spilling through the stained glass onto the floor. It landed right on the letter, illuminating the smudged ink like it had been waiting for that moment all along. She took out her phone, opened her social media app, and stared at the blank post field. Her hands shook, but she began to type. My father, Robert Hale, passed away the night of my wedding. I didn't invite him. He came anyway. He watched from outside, quietly, lovingly, like he always did. He left me this letter, and I want the world to know the kind of man he was. She attached a photo of the letter, not all of it, just the part that read, even when I was standing outside the window. When she hit post, she didn't expect the world to care. But by morning, they did. Thousands of comments. Strangers writing about their own fathers, the things they wished they'd said, the calls they'd forgotten to make. Emily read each one, tears spilling freely now, not from grief but from recognition. Her father's story had become something larger, a mirror reflecting the quiet sacrifices people make out of love. She sat by the window as the first light of dawn broke across the sky. The letter lay open on the table beside her, edges curling from her tears. Outside, the world stirred awake. She whispered into the soft morning air, I see you now, Dad, I see everything. And somewhere in the space between memory and forgiveness, she could almost feel him smiling back. A father finally seen, a love finally understood. It started 3 days after the post. Emily was still waking up in pieces, half in grief, half in disbelief, when her phone began to vibrate non-stop on the nightstand. At first, she ignored it. Then the buzzing didn't stop. She squinted at the screen. Hundreds of notifications, dozens of messages from people she didn't know. Her post, the one with her father's letter, had spread like wildfire. The comments flooded in faster than she could read them. I'm crying at work. This broke me. My dad's still alive. I'm calling him right now. He watched from outside. Oh God, this hurts. She scrolled, eyes burning. Somewhere between the words of strangers and the flood of sympathy, a name she recognized caught her attention. The Belmont photographer. She clicked the message. Emily, I saw your post. I think I have something you need to see. I didn't realize what it was until now. Attached was a single photo. It had been taken during the wedding reception, one of those candid, in-between moments that often got deleted later. Emily clicked it open, expecting another smiling group shot. Instead, the image froze her. There she was, standing inside the ballroom, surrounded by friends and laughter, a glass of champagne in her hand. Through the window behind her, faintly visible in the reflection of the lights, was her father. He was standing outside, looking in. His hand rested lightly against the glass. He wasn't smiling, but his expression held something deeper, a kind of quiet, fragile pride. For a moment she couldn't move. Her breath hitched. The photo felt alive, as if time itself had folded to let her see what she'd been blind to that night. She zoomed in until the pixels blurred. His outline softened, but his presence didn't. He looked tired, but also peaceful, as though in that 1 second he'd seen everything he needed to see. Her hands trembled as she saved the image to her phone. That evening she posted it. No caption this time, just the photo. Within an hour it was everywhere. News outlets picked it up. Journalists called it the photo that broke the internet's heart. TV anchors read her father's letter aloud on morning shows. Comments poured in from every corner of the world, stories of estranged families, regrets, reconciliations. Someone wrote, he stood in the rain so she could stand in the light. Another, that's what love looks like, unseen but never absent. Emily read them all, tears streaming silently. For the first time, she didn't feel alone in her grief. A week later, she was invited to speak on a radio program about the story. She almost said no. But something inside, something her father had left behind, told her to go. The studio was small and warm, filled with the faint hum of static. The host, A gentle-voiced woman named Claire introduced her softly. Today we're joined by Emily Patterson, the woman behind the letter that reminded the world what a father's love truly means. Emily adjusted the headphones, her fingers trembling slightly. Claire's voice came through. Emily, when you look at that photo now, the one of your father standing outside the window, what do you see? Emily swallowed hard. I see forgiveness, his not mine. The room went quiet, she continued, her voice steadying. He didn't come to be seen, he came to make sure I was happy, that's who he was. I think love, the kind that lasts, doesn't ask for attention, it just shows up, even when it hurts. Claire nodded. And what would you say to him now if you could? Emily smiled through the ache. I'd tell him I finally see him and I hope he knows the world does too. When the show ended, she stepped outside. The air smelled of autumn, faintly metallic like the world turning quietly beneath her feet. Her phone buzzed again. It was Walter. Kiddo, you'd better check the Belmont's page, his message read. She opened it. The Belmont Hotel had shared the viral photo, but they'd added something new, an image from their security camera that same night. It showed her father walking away down the path after the wedding. The frame was grainy, but his figure was unmistakable, small, steady, a paper bag in hand. Underneath, the caption read, he left this photo for his daughter. He never came inside, but love doesn't need a seat at the table to be real. Thousands of comments followed. People leaving hearts, stories, even letters addressed to their own parents. Emily sat on the curb outside the studio, scrolling through them as the city hummed around her. Cars passed, lights flickered in shop windows, a busker played a soft tune on his guitar nearby, the world moving as it always had. But she felt something different this time. Not guilt, not even sadness, just gratitude. A few weeks later, she framed the viral photo and hung it in her living room. Right beside it, she placed the silver frame her father had left behind, one from her childhood. 2 photos, 2 versions of love, one seen, one unseen. When visitors came, they always asked about them. And every time she told the story, not for sympathy, but because telling it made her feel closer to him, as if speaking his name aloud kept some part of him alive in the world. One night, long after Mark had gone to bed, she sat alone by the window with a cup of tea. The street outside glowed with the amber light of passing cars. On the coffee table, her phone screen lit up again, another message from a stranger. I called my dad today because of your story. Thank you for reminding me what matters. She smiled softly, set the phone down, and looked up at the photos. The man in the reflection, the little girl on his shoulders, both forever caught between glass and light. She whispered, you did it, Dad. You kept your promise. You got me there. Outside, the night stretched quiet and forgiving, and in the faint reflection of the window, for just a moment, she thought she saw him standing there again, watching and smiling. Months passed, but his voice never really left her. It came to her at the quietest times, in the soft scrape of the kettle on the stove, in the hum of the refrigerator late at night, in the pauses between her own breaths. Not loud, not ghostly, just there. She could almost hear him saying, slow down, kiddo, the world's not running away. It startled her at first, that instinct to answer someone who wasn't there, but over time she stopped resisting it. Some loves, she realized, don't die, they just learn to whisper. She had started volunteering at a hospice near the hospital where he'd passed. It wasn't something she planned, it just felt like the only place where her heart made sense again. Every Tuesday she'd sit with the patients who didn't have visitors. She brought books, sometimes cookies, mostly her time. An older man named Charles reminded her of her father, the same stubborn kindness, the same rough laugh. He'd talk about his daughter who lived 3 states away. She calls when she can, he'd say, pretending it didn't matter. Emily would smile, pretending along with him. One afternoon, she asked if he wanted to record a message for her, something she could play back if she missed him. Charles chuckled. I don't think my voice is worth remembering. Emily felt something twist inside her. It always is, she said softly. To someone, it always is. He looked at her for a long time before nodding. That evening, she held up her phone and pressed record while he spoke about the time he taught his daughter to ride a bike. His words stumbled, then steadied. When he finished, she saw the relief in his eyes, the way speaking aloud made him feel like he still existed in the world. That night when she got home, she sat on the floor beside the window and played the recording back. Charles's voice filled the room, frail but full of warmth. and beneath it, faintly, she could almost imagine her father's voice overlapping, the same cadence, the same quiet pride. Sometimes she would find herself talking to him out loud, not in prayer but in conversation. "I saw the post hit 1 million likes today, Dad," she'd say while folding laundry. Or, "You wouldn't believe it. Someone recognized me at the grocery store." She imagined his laugh, the small shake of his head. "Famous for making people cry, huh?" He'd tease. She'd smile at the thought. But there were harder nights too. Nights when guilt still slipped through the cracks of healing. She'd sit at the kitchen table, the letter spread before her like a mirror she couldn't stop looking into. "I should have called," she'd whisper. "I should have known." And somehow the silence would soften, not answering but forgiving. One weekend she visited his house. It had been months since the funeral, but the key still fit perfectly in the lock. The air inside carried his scent. Faint soap, old coffee cedar. Dust floated in the sunlight cutting across the living room. Everything was as he'd left it, his reading glasses on the side table, his boots by the door, the old ledger still sitting beside the armchair. She walked through the room slowly, touching the things he'd touched. In the kitchen, she found a small cassette player on the counter, the kind he used to play jazz on Sunday mornings. Curious, she pressed play. The tape crackled, hissed, then a familiar voice filled the room. "Testing, 1, 2, okay." A pause. "If you're hearing this, it means I finally learned how to work this thing." It was him. Emily's knees nearly gave out. She gripped the counter as his laughter, soft, self-deprecating, rolled through the room. "I wanted to record a few things just in case," he continued. "Not because I think I'm important, just because I figured you might want to hear me someday." She pressed a hand to her mouth. His voice went on, calm and steady. "Emily, if life ever feels too heavy, just remember you don't have to carry it all at once. Set it down, breathe. Let someone else take a corner of it for you. That's not weakness, that's human." He laughed again. "And for God's sake, eat something. You forget when you're sad, you always did." Tears blurred her vision. She sank to the floor, the cassette still playing. "I'm proud of you, Em," he said finally. "I don't know what kind of woman you'll be when you hear this, but I bet you'll make me wish I'd lived just a little longer to see it." The tape clicked softly as it ended. Emily sat there for a long time, the room wrapped in silence. Then she rewound it, pressed play again, and again, and again. The voice filled the spaces of the house, drifting down the hallway, through the open windows, into the trees outside. It felt like breathing again. Later that night, she packed the cassette player carefully into a small box, along with his letter and the framed photograph. On the lid she wrote, "For when I forget the sound of love." She placed it on the highest shelf, not to hide it but to keep it safe. When she turned to leave, she whispered, "You stayed longer than I deserved, Dad. Thank you for not leaving completely." Outside, the wind shifted, a soft murmur that moved through the trees, brushing against her hair like a hand. And in that quiet, she heard it again, faint, almost lost in the air. "That's my girl." She smiled through her tears, closed the door behind her, and stepped into the night. The world hadn't changed, but she had, carrying a voice that would never fade, a love that would never need to speak louder than a whisper to be heard. It had been almost a year since that night, the night her father stood outside the glass window, watching the moment he'd spent a lifetime preparing her for. Seasons had changed quietly, as they always do. The flowers from her wedding bouquet had long since faded, pressed between the pages of a book she hadn't opened in months. And yet some days, when the wind moved a certain way or the morning light caught the window just right, Emily could still see him, a faint reflection in memory's glass, patient, proud, eternal. She no longer cried when she thought of him, not because she'd stopped missing him, but because love, when it's deep enough, turns grief into something else, something quieter, something that sits beside you instead of breaking you. One evening, she found herself back at the lake where he used to take her as a child. The same dock, the same creaking boards. She sat with her shoes off, her feet just brushing the surface of the water. The air smelled like pine in summer, and the sky had begun to soften into that dusky orange that always made the world feel gentler. She spoke softly, like he was sitting beside her. "I used to think love was about grand gestures," she said. "The big things, weddings, gifts, milestones." Her voice caught slightly. "But now I think it's in the small things, the quiet things, the times you showed up even when nobody noticed." A single ripple spread across the lake. She smiled. Reaching into her bag, she pulled out a small wooden box, the one she'd made from his old workbench scraps. Inside were three things: the letter, the childhood photo, and a cassette tape. She held the tape in her palm for a long time, feeling its weight, its quiet history. Then gently she whispered, "You can rest now, Dad. I'll take it from here." She placed the box in the water and gave it a small push. It floated, steady, carried by the current toward the horizon. The reflection of the sky shimmered around it, gold, then pink, then silver, until it was just a small dark shape moving farther and farther away. The air around her stilled, no sound but the gentle tap of the waves against the dock, and in that stillness she heard it again, faint like a heartbeat between worlds. "You did good, sweetheart." Her breath caught. Then she laughed through her tears, nodding as though he were really there. "Yeah," she whispered, "I think I finally did." In the months that followed, Emily began to write. Not for fame, not even for closure, but because stories were how her father lived on. She wrote about him, the way he burned pancakes, the way he always hummed when nervous, the way he never walked into a room without checking if someone else needed the light first. She wrote for others too, stories of love, forgiveness, and the small acts that hold people together. Her posts reached millions. Strangers began sending her letters, children who wanted to make amends with their parents, fathers who wanted to say sorry, daughters who finally understood what sacrifice really meant. One message stayed with her. It read, "I found my dad's number after 20 years. I called him today. We didn't say much, but we said enough. Thank you for reminding me that love doesn't always wait for an invitation." Emily printed that message and pinned it above her desk. Every time she looked at it, she thought of her father's letter, the line that had changed everything. "Even when I was standing outside the window." It wasn't just a sentence anymore. It was a truth that real love doesn't need recognition to exist. It simply stays. One night, while preparing a talk for a family foundation, Emily paused and looked straight into the camera. Her tone was quiet, but her words carried the kind of weight that only comes from having lived them. "If you're watching this," she said, "and there's someone you love, someone you haven't spoken to in a while, I want you to ask yourself something. If tonight were your last chance, what would you say? Would you wait for the perfect moment? Or would you pick up the phone, knock on their door, and say what your heart's been trying to say all along? Because the truth is, love doesn't always wait. Sometimes it stands outside the window, hoping you'll look back before it's gone." She let the silence sit after that, a silence that wasn't empty but full. Then she added, her voice trembling just slightly, "So call them, forgive them, or at least tell them they mattered. You don't need a wedding, a letter, or a viral post to remind someone they're loved. You just need now." When the camera stopped rolling, she sat back, tears stinging her eyes, not from sadness, but from the strange beauty of knowing she was finally giving back what he had given her. That video, like the letter, traveled far. It became something people sent to each other late at night when words failed. A reminder, a nudge, a quiet whisper that said, "It's not too late." And every time someone shared it, somewhere in the world a conversation began that might never have happened otherwise. A father answered a phone. A daughter forgave. A door that had been closed for years opened again, just a little. On the anniversary of her father's passing, Emily returned to the same lake. This time, she brought her own daughter, a small, curious 6-year-old with his same brown eyes. They sat together on the dock, legs dangling over the water. The girl pointed up at the sky. "Mommy, look, the stars came back." Emily smiled, the words catching her like an echo. "They always do," she said. Her daughter leaned her head on her shoulder. "Do you miss Grandpa?" "Every day," Emily whispered. "But he's still here, just quieter." The little girl nodded, satisfied with that answer, and went back to counting the stars. Emily looked out at the horizon, her heart steady. In the reflection of the lake, she saw her daughter's face beside her own, 2 generations framed in the same circle of light. And for a moment it felt as if the world had come full circle. Her father had built her a life of love. Now she was building one too. And now maybe this story has found you. Maybe there's someone you haven't spoken to in a while, a father, a mother, a brother, a friend, someone you once loved deeply but let drift away because life got busy, pride got louder, or silence just felt easier. Ask yourself, what would you do if you knew tomorrow wasn't promised? Would you keep waiting for the right time? Or would you reach out right now while there's still a window between you? Because one day that window might close, and you might find yourself wishing for just one more chance to say, "I love you. I forgive you. You mattered to me." You don't need a perfect apology. You just need the courage to care before it's too late. That's what this story is about. Not loss, but presence. Not regret, but remembrance. It's about the people who show up even when they are not invited, who love quietly, and who stay long after their voices fade. If you've listened all the way to this point, thank you truly for staying with this story, for opening your heart to something real. And before you go, if it touched you, if it made you think of someone you love, call them tonight. Send that message. Forgive what needs forgiving. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, stories about love, family, and the moments that define us, please subscribe, share, and stay connected with our channel. Because every time you listen, every time you share, you keep these stories and the people inside them alive. Until next time, take care of yourself, take care of your family, and remember, love doesn't end. It just changes rooms. Thank you for listening. And may your home, wherever it is, always echo with the voices of those who never stopped loving you.